Welcome to Gamebird Spotlight, a program supported by North American Gamebird Association. And today we have two guests with us, Rob Sexton, our executive director, and Abbu Schuft, who is with the Minnesota, let me get this right, Extension Education Office. And welcome, Abbu. Glad to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
All right. I understand that you're also working on your doctorate.
I am. My career and my education go hand in hand. And so at the University of Minnesota Extension, I focus on poultry biosecurity. And so my PhD studies and research have continued to parallel that, where I'm studying biosecurity education and the methods that we use and how do those messages stick. And I've been able to work with youth in Minnesota about biosecurity with all of the 4-H livestock projects. And then currently I'm analyzing some information about entries and exits in a biosecure fashion and the instructions that are given to those individuals. And then we recorded them. And so I'm essentially counting their errors against what the protocols were given. And then we can compare that to the instruction type and be able to better advise producers and small flock owners and preserves and hunting clubs on how to better provide instructions for biosecure entries and exits to their premises.
Would this be something like what they call a Dutch entry?
Yep, Danish entry.
Danish entry.
Yep, okay. Yep. And there's many modifications. There's basic concepts. There's a 2-zone Danish entry, which is just a clean and a dirty line, and then there's a 3-zone, which has a clean area, a gray area, which might be like a shower space or an office space or something, a sort of a neutral gray zone, and then the dirty zone. So there's basic fundamentals of a Danish entry, but each premises has different modifications, obviously, according to what their structures and their operational flow is for that Danish entry. So we want to be able to make sure that they have the appropriate instructions for employees and guests and visitors so that those protocols are adhered to each time a Danish entry is used or any biosecure entry and exit is employed.
I want this stuff. How are you going to teach me? I want to come out there and be your student.
I will gladly teach anybody. I will travel. You can travel to me. Obviously, I'm still analyzing all of the data right now, but it's a large part of my job in extension as well for the University of Minnesota is teaching that Danish entry. We've worked with processing plants. I've worked with chicken layer and broiler farms. I've worked with small flock owners, and I've even worked with a few Gamebird producers here in Minnesota about how to handle when they have consumer traffic in addition to their employee traffic, and how can they best employ biosecurity on their premises. So I'm very happy to help consult.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That is awesome. Now, rumor has it that you're going to be coming to our hunting preserve seminar, our conference that we are holding in July.
So how could I pass up the first one?
That's awesome. I am
happy to join in.
Rob, do you have questions for Abbu?
Oh, yeah, well, more than we have time for probably, right? So, Abbu, why don't we just start where you just left off? So, tell our folks, how important is this Danish entry system, and how big of a risk is that particular item on your farm or on your hunt club?
A Danish entry is going to be more of a categorized way of providing an entry to your premises. There's, for those of our producers that have had to do the NPIP biosecurity plan audit, there are terms that I'm also going to introduce to this audience as well. One of those terms is a line of separation, and that is separating the healthy, uninfected birds. And we're not just talking about influenza, we're talking about any type of illness that can affect birds. We're separating those healthy birds from the rest of the outside world. With the game bird industry, it's more of a challenge because most of those birds, once they leave the brooder, they are housed outdoors.
Mm-hmm.
But there are still ways to be able to use a line of separation. And that's where Danish entry comes into play. The Danish entry is what are the protocols that surround that line of separation. So again, the line of separation is the outside world from where your healthy birds are being raised. So for a brooder, it might be the door and the immediate area before the door and after the door. So on the exterior of the building where you might be brooding those young birds, what sort of steps will you take before crossing the threshold of that door into the barn? And then what protocols will you have? Will you have barn specific boots that you only wear in that brooder? Are you going to wear coveralls? Are you making sure you're wearing clean clothes? So there's going to be different types of modifications that each premises will have. There's also another term that was introduced called the perimeter buffer area. And that is merely like the bigger boundary of your farm. And that might be the entrance, your driveway. It might be the area that encompasses all of your flight pens and your brooders. It might include for our game bird or our hunt clubs, I should say, or the preserves, it might include your entire property. What's the outer boundary that are going to be the first steps of protection? So that's that perimeter buffer area. So going back to Danish entry, there's likely going to be or should be multiple Danish entries on a premises. For our hunting clubs, maybe that's entering the clubhouse and then exiting the clubhouse to go to the fields where the hunts would actually take place. Mm-hmm. And then there might be a line of separation from an office space to where the birds are actually kept and housed before they are sent out for their hunt. So that Danish entry can fluctuate, and it should fluctuate for each premises. Again, there's going to be certain standards that are used as recommendations as a starting point, but then each premises and each facility needs to be able to assess what works best for their workflow, for their business flow, and for the structures that they have in place.
So Abby, Peg and I remember the avian flu outbreaks from 2014 and 15 when all we were talking about, was various critters getting into our pens, and they were likely the carriers. We talked about rodent protection. We talked about, swallows and songbirds and raptors. And of course we talked about ducks, but it turned out, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but it turned out that foot traffic was a major factor in a lot of the spread back in 14 and 15. And that led to all of this discussion of Danish entries. Am I right about that?
It was. And foot traffic could be more broadly defined as farm to farm transfer, meaning people and the equipment that we were moving back and forth were truly the carriers that was going farm to farm. There's a good point and a bad point for 2022 that we're not seeing that thus far in this outbreak. So the education efforts, the effort that everybody's been putting into improving their biosecurity, the training that's being provided, the effort of the employees to take that training and actually implement it, that's working. The bad point is that's not how 2022 is being introduced. We are seeing that from wild bird introductions.
Right. And so one of the first questions that often gets asked, we get reports anytime a game bird farm is affected or a hunting club is affected. and when we get those reports, I think one of the first things we ask is, do they
Have
have ducks on their property? So tell us, what's the situation with ducks, and why is that a concern that at least needs to be one way or the other addressed in terms of how you run your farm?
So it is clearly demonstrated in literature that ducks and geese are natural reservoirs for H5 and H7 avian influenzas. They often don't become ill themselves. And so they would be considered an asymptomatic carrier. That might be a term that some of us are familiar with because of the COVID pandemic. And the challenge is when the ducks would be commingling with your grouse or your chukars or your pheasants, because the ducks aren't appearing to be ill because they're not often affected by the illness, but then they can carry it. And if they are commingling with your other birds, they can infect those birds rather quickly. In the risk assessment in the Secure Upland Gamebird Supply Plan, there was a review essentially of any of the game bird farms that had high path avian influenza over a course of 35 years. And of the 39 farms, 37 of them commingled with ducks.
Wow.
And so it is truly
highly
a
correlated.
high risk issue to have those birds commingling.
Yeah, gosh. So if our farm doesn't have ducks, but we're in an area, that's a flyway where ducks are obviously going north and south throughout the year, are there steps that we can take to be less attractive to ducks coming into your property?
Yes. It will be more of a challenge, I think, though, for the preserves and the hunt clubs, because you naturally have those landscapes that are attractive to animals, to wild birds, I should say. And so like for our small flock producers who this is their first like introduction truly to avian influenza, that's our biggest message, is to make your property least attractive to wild birds to even stop and rest. So minimizing open water as best as possible. If you have natural ponds or lakes or what have you, we're not expecting you to drain those bodies of water, but there are other management things you can supervise to make sure that any of your personnel are staying away from that area. You're not allowing hunters in those areas. You're not allowing dogs into those areas. So it's a matter of conceptual biosecurity, which I've written about and Dr. Cardona has written about in your NAGA news in previous issues, where conceptual biosecurity is what's around you, what's your environment. So how do you work with what you have? Now, standing water in your driveways and your gravel roads, that can be minimized by some maintenance, right? It'll take some effort and some hours probably, but you can minimize those types of things. We're not asking you again to drain your ponds or drain a lake, but how can you manage your biosecurity to work with that concept of your environment that's around you? Other management things that you can do is making sure that you're controlling feed spills. Don't provide a buffet for wild birds to stop and rest. If you have feed spills or a grain bin that might be malfunctioning, or grain bags that are stored outdoors, bring them inside. Make sure your feed bin is repaired. Clean up spills that happen immediately. What else was I going to say? I'm drawing a blank now.
Well, I've got a couple follow-ups anyway.
Okay.
You mentioned, not the whole idea of, not being attractive to ducks. We've talked to some of the affected clubs around the country, and one thing we learned is that, not to go try to round up game birds that, were not shot at the hunt club and return them back to your own pens. Right? That
Which
once
has
they're
been
out on your
pretty much-
property.
Yeah, that's pretty much been standard operating procedure because of the economics. But all of a sudden now, it's not such a good idea, is it?
Right, because you don't know what type of interactions they might have had, or you don't know where ducks, wild waterfowl, or had been, and then here you're traipsing through, you're driving your side by side through, and you've got cages or what have you. But absolutely, yeah, I can imagine it's been standard protocol because that's money.
Right.
You're wasting money by leaving those birds out there. So the best solution is probably going to be to modify how you release those hunts. Maybe you limit how many birds go out. And you're just upfront that, we're not going to recollect those birds. Here's your 20 birds, you get what you get, and then we're going to leave them out there, and you'll just have to work with that in your business budget, and what how you can stay in the black with that type of an option. So making some modifications is going to be necessary, just because this is unprecedented times, right?
Right.
I know it's a term that we're tired of for the last
Right.
2 years, almost, going on our third year, but we have to be able to adapt to what's presented in front of us. And maybe that's the option, because that becomes a very high risk move to go retrieve those unused birds,
Right.
and bring them back to your holding pens, and you don't know where they've been.
Right.
That's the easiest thing to say is,
Well, Peg, I know one group of people who will really will like the fact that you're not going back and getting those birds, and that's the next group of hunters that hit that field, right?
And the neighbors who hunt the line, they're going to love that. But
Yeah.
the birds, when we release a pheasant, it becomes a wild bird. It becomes liberated. It's going to go where it goes. They do tend to come together where there are other birds, but all of a sudden the trade-off isn't all that good.
No.
There's been a sea change in thought. Some of these things. Talk a little bit about dogs.
Yeah.
When I remember when the pandemic started, there were people who euthanized their dogs because of the misinformation that they could give it to their dog or cat, or it could transmit it, and they euthanized their animals. Now we're hearing there's a possibility dogs can carry avian influenza, yet we don't want to get rid of our dogs. They're a part of the hunt experience. So what can we do? And what is the risk?
it's not necessarily that the dogs can become infected like a wild bird would and then defecate somewhere and then we walk through the dog poop. That's not our concern with the dogs. Our concern with the dogs is, if I'm a dog lover, let me just say that. But in a hunt, dogs are a tool, right? And so we have to think of them as a piece of equipment or a tool. So then that could become they're living, so they would become a fomite. So if they are grabbing an infected bird, or they are wading into the pond or the swamp to retrieve that bird, they have now potentially been exposed to infected water, or an infected bird. And if I realize they're not supposed to be puncturing that bird, but if it happens accidentally, then, how could they release that virus? How are you're going to praise the dog when it comes back with a successful retrieve? Right. And so you're going to pet that dog that has just waded through potentially infected waters, because again, you don't know what duck has been in and visited that pond. And so that's going to be the biggest challenge. So it's not that the dogs might be potentially become infected, is they can become a fomite and spread that unknowingly.
For the uninitiated, explain fomite. I think these are some terms a lot of our industry might not be familiar with.
So a fomite is going to be, I think dogs are hard to categorize, because a fomite is going to be an intangible thing, like a pitchfork or a shovel or a side-by-side that could unintentionally have that virus on it, and then we're touching it. A doorknob.
it's a carrier that's not infected like the duck is, but
Yes.
it's still a means of
transferring the virus.
vector,
Yep.
a vector for transmitting the
Yep.
disease.
So the difference between a vector and a fomite is one's living, one's not.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yep.
So,
No.
you know what occurs to me as we're discussing this, it goes back to the word you used previously, separation, right? So once the birds are in the field, once the dogs are in the field, there's a chance they're going to come into contact with this virus. If you want to protect the birds that are in your holding pens, then you really need to have some level of separation with your hunters and the personnel that are dealing with the holding pens versus those that are out doing the hunts, right? I mean,
Yes.
if the same person who's out hunting then goes to the holding pens, then that's a risk factor right there, is it not?
Right.
Yes. Yep. And that's that whole line of separation. So generally, when they're out in the hunting fields, we would consider that's dirty because that's potentially contaminated. So you don't want them to be allowed to come back into holding pens which are clean afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
If that is a request that they want to see the birds as part of the hunt, then that needs to occur before they are actually out in the field. And then just have it as a hard rule that hunters don't get to go back into.
Right. And they wouldn't anyway. That is part of the industry separation that usually someone has a farm or a facility that is a raising area, and they might have a farm that is the hunting area.
Yep.
And so setting that and having staff that only goes to retrieve birds and brings them so far, doesn't come further than that line of separation, doesn't take them to the field. It's a very good idea.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it will likely take some planning logistically, like personnel. Okay. So if we know employee B is going to take those birds from the holding pen and go set them, what are they doing it at what time? And then what protocols do they need to go through before they can re-enter? So if maybe there's 2 hunts scheduled in a day, what protocols will they do before they re-enter the holding pens to grab the second group of birds to set them? Or maybe it's a clean person who sets the second set. So making sure that you always have clean people going into that holding area and keeping that very, very separate.
Mm-hmm. It takes some planning ahead is what you're really driving at.
Absolutely. And training and conversation. I think that's one of the biggest challenges is as a manager or a farm owner, just making the decision of how that protocol is going to work. But maybe there's an employee who likes to do the routine a little differently. They're still accomplishing the task that's desired by the owner, but they do it in a different manner. So having that conversation with those people who would actually be doing the tasks is really essential as well. We call them desire paths. And I know I have written about that too in one of the NAGA news articles. And really it's just an overview of a desire path is if you think of a large campus, for example, in the middle of the winter, and there's sidewalks that are all cleared. But then you see tracks, footprints through the snow going a different direction because somebody wanted to travel on their own desired path, a shorter route, a different direct route to get there rather than taking the long way around on the sidewalk. So that would be a desire path. So having that conversation with any of those employees will be essential because maybe their desire path needs to be altered or modified in order to properly execute biosecurity.
You put up a snow fence so they can't go across the wrong way. Abby, thank you so much for being with us. I think we've covered everything that we really wanted to hit today, and I don't want to take up any more of your valuable time. We appreciate the work. We appreciate the articles. And you've mentioned several of them. So for our members that are watching, I want to stress, you can go back into the NAGA archives. All of the articles are archived there. Some of them specifically have a topic. Some of them are just by the issue. But look back through, and that is one of the benefits of being an NAGA member, is that you have access to those articles. And we're looking forward to more from you to come. And appreciate the support and the partnership that you've given to the NAGA.
Well, thank you. I look forward to seeing both of you in July, and as well as meeting so many other members out at that conference.
Rob, what do you have to offer?
Well, I just want to say that I can't wait to see your full presentation.
Yes.
I think this has been a big teaser of what we're likely to see, and it's already just been illuminating. So can't wait to have you there. And then to elaborate on what you said, Peg, those archives can be found on our website at northamericangamebird.com. And that's where you'll be able to locate any of Abby's previous articles and also contributions from our many other authors.
That's right. NorthAmericanGamebird.com, where the North American Gamebird Association, those people who raise pheasants, chukars, Hungarian, other upland game birds. Thank you again. I'm going to let you two go and wrap this up. This will be aired as a pre-recorded program. If you have questions, put them in the comments. One of us will be monitoring. We thank you, both of you, for your time.
Thank you, Peg.
Thank you.